Well, it looks like we're looking at the start of a NATO Civil War. It began with a letter demanding a Nobel Prize, it turned into a trade war, and now it has escalated to more troops on the ground.
Europe has just aimed a trade bazooka at the U.S. economy to stop a hostile takeover of Greenland. And in the middle of it, the Premier of Manitoba says Canada's only way out is the tiny Arctic port called Churchill.
Stay with us because today we're going to show you how a bruised ego over a Nobel Peace Prize turned into a tariff on allies, NATO troops on the ice, and a real question about whether Canadian soldiers end up in the snow line between Washington and Europe.
Let's start with the message that should never have been sent. Trump sends a direct message to Norway's Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Store. He says, "Considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars plus, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace, but can now think about what is good and proper for the United States of America."
Now remember, everybody, Norway doesn't control Greenland, and the Prime Minister doesn't pick the winner. It's an independent committee. But he writes anyway because he's furious that he didn't get the 2025 prize.
And then he tries to argue that Denmark doesn't even own the island. This is the line that is melting everyone's brains. He wrote, "There are no written documents. It's only that a boat landed there hundreds of years ago. But we had boats landing there also." He is literally arguing finders keepers.
And he finishes it with the ultimatum. The world is not secure unless we have complete and total control of Greenland. But let's translate what control actually means here, because militarily, the U.S. already has access.
Exactly. Under the 1951 Defense Treaty, the U.S. already has the right to operate bases and deploy troops. They don't need to buy the island to defend it. They have it.
So, when he demands total control, he isn't talking about missile defense. He's talking about ownership. He wants the exclusive deed to the lithium, the uranium, the rare earth minerals melting out of the ice. And he wants to make sure that China can't buy a single ounce of it.
But there is a second layer to all this: ego. He doesn't just want the island, he wants the validation he feels he was robbed of. So in one of the weirdest photo ops of the year, Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado visits Washington and gives Trump her medal. Trump loved it. He called it a wonderful gesture and a great honor.
So Machado gave him the most prestigious award on earth, hoping that he would finally endorse her as the leader of Venezuela. But he didn't. He took the medal, called her a wonderful woman, gave her a Trump gift bag, and then went right back to cutting deals with Maduro's vice president.
So look at where Machado is now. She doesn't have the medal anymore. She isn't the president of Venezuela. And honestly, she has lost a massive amount of credibility by treating a Nobel Prize like a bargaining chip that didn't even pay out.
Yeah, it's deeply weird. She walked in as a historic figure and walked out empty-handed. And that's the warning to Europe right there. If he will do that to a freedom fighter bringing him gold, what will he do to Denmark?
And now Europe stopped treating this as a passing outburst and has started treating it as a problem that they have to handle. Because alongside the letter, you've got the money threat. Tariffs. Again.
10% import tax starting in February on goods from 8 European nations: Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and the UK. Rising to 25% in June if they keep opposing U.S. control of Greenland.
The trigger this time? Well, those countries sent small numbers of troops and trainers to Greenland at Denmark's request. A Danish-led exercise in the Arctic showing that Allied forces are present and watching.
So Trump says that deployment endangers his Golden Dome missile defense concept for North America. He claims he needs Greenland to defend everyone from incoming missiles and rival powers in the Arctic. So the pitch is basically, help me get the island, or I hit your economies.
Europe reads that as exactly what it looks like: commercial blackmail tied to a territorial demand.
Now you've got the statements flying. Denmark's foreign minister saying, you can trade with people, but you don't trade people. And EU leaders warning of a dangerous downward spiral.
Thousands of people take the streets in both Denmark and in Nuuk, Greenland's capital. banners, speeches, ordinary Greenlanders saying, "We're not your property. Greenland's not for sale." For Greenland, that's the biggest protest they've ever seen.
And while all that's happening, EU Council President Antonio Costa calls an extraordinary summit. Ambassadors already met on Sunday, and leaders will meet again later this week. This isn't being left to mid-level committees anymore.
And that's where Emmanuel Macron steps out with something new, the Anti-Coercion instrument. It sounds dry, but it's the most important phrase in this whole story. This thing got nicknamed the Trade Bazooka for a reason.
Yep, the EU built it after years of watching bigger powers push smaller ones around with tariffs and market threats. The idea is pretty simple. If you try to economically bully one EU state, the whole bloc can respond with serious coordinated measures.
Not just a tit-for-tat tariffs on cheese and cars. This lets them limit access to public contracts, puts conditions on investments, squeezes access to the single market in certain sectors. It even can tamper with intellectual property protections for the companies from the bullying country.
And that's not hitting a few crates at a port. That's going after business models, digital services, major contracts, capital flows. Macron is now saying if Trump follows through on these Greenland tariffs, he'll push to activate this instrument for the first time ever.
Members of the European Parliament are cheering that on. The Trade Committee chairs publicly say this is exactly the case that this tool was built for.
And remember, this stacks on top of retaliatory tariff packages that Europe already has on ice from previous trade fights. Now, some of those suspensions expire in early February. So you've got Trump's clock, tariffs rising into June, and Europe's clock, existing penalties ready to be switched back on, plus this new bazooka waiting on a political decision.
And that's why people in Brussels and Berlin are not calling this a spat. They're talking about a potential trade war between allies, driven not by a normal dispute over steel or subsidies, but an argument over the future of an Arctic territory.
And while diplomats argue, the security people are busy as well. NATO Security General Mark Rutte meets Denmark's defense minister and Greenland's foreign minister in Brussels. They're discussing the idea of a formal NATO mission in Greenland and the wider Arctic. Not just individual exercises, but a framework that says this region is part of our shared defense.
Denmark and Greenland have actually proposed this. From their point of view, if you've got a US president openly questioning your sovereignty and hinting about force, having NATO clearly acknowledge your patch of ice as part of the collective perimeter suddenly seemed like a smart idea.
Yep. And add to that Russia and China. Moscow complains that the West is constantly painting them as a threat to Greenland, and Beijing pushes back on Trump's rhetoric and tells the US to stop using China as pretext for its own goals.
So Greenland's status has now dragged in Washington, Ottawa, Brussels, Moscow, and Beijing. Everyone insists they're the sensible ones, and everyone's saying they're only responding to someone else's escalation, which they are.
Yeah, exactly. And Greenland's Prime Minister, Jens Frederik Nielsen, posts a very plain statement. We will not be pressured. We will stand firm on dialogue, on respect, and on international law.
Now, where is Canada in all of this?
Well, our Prime Minister was just in Doha, Qatar, working on investment for Canadian infrastructure and talking about trade diversification. And reporters kept asking him about Greenland.
He calls Trump's move an escalation, says Canada is concerned, very concerned. He repeats the line that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries has to be respected.
But then he adds an important layer. The security of Greenland falls within NATO's responsibility, which is a very diplomatic way of saying if this goes sideways, it's not just Denmark's problem.
At the same time, there are leaks that Canada is weighing whether to send soldiers to join NATO exercises in Greenland. Even a small Canadian contingent would be a big political signal. Carney has also been trying to make Canada less dependent on the US for trade. He has deals with Europe, with Asia, with the Gulf, and now big breakthroughs with China. And now that Qatar angle isn't random. If that investment into Canadian projects goes ahead, it's part of the same strategy that you don't leave all your eggs under one White House.
So, while he's out there trying to line up cranes and concrete for housing and transit, he's suddenly answering for a crisis in Greenland that could slam our exporters again and blow up the energy conversation in the Arctic.
And this is where it gets very real for Canadians, because you can watch all of this and think, well, that's Europe's headache. But it isn't just theirs.
You know, if Europe fires that trade bazooka at the US, it's not happening in a vacuum. American companies hit by restrictions on the EU look for leverage elsewhere. They push harder in North America. They demand more favorable terms in CUSMA talks. They look to squeeze costs and supply chains that run straight through Canadian plants.
Tariff wars over Greenland might not mention Canada in the headline, but they absolutely show up in our jobs reports. That's auto, aerospace, agriculture, tech, anything that depends on predictable access to both the US and EU markets, well, it gets caught in the middle.
And on the Arctic side, the precedent is even more worrying. If a US president can use tariffs to pressure Denmark over the future of Greenland without any shame about tying his own bruised feelings over a prize, well, why would he treat Canadian Arctic questions as sacred?
We've got shipping routes opening up through the Northwest Passage. We've got resources, deposits in the north, and indigenous communities who've spent decades fighting to have their rights recognized.
And if the message to the world is, you can threaten allies' economies to get what you want in the Arctic, that doesn't stop at the border between Greenland and Ellesmere Island.
And that's why Europe's response here matters almost as much as the original threat. If they stand firm, activate big economic tools, and hold the line, it sends a signal that this approach is costly and unpopular even among allies.
But if they hesitate or split or accept some cosmetic compromise that leaves Greenland in permanent limbo, that sends a different message. This technique works, and you'll see it again. Maybe not next month, but you will.
Now, there's another layer underneath all of this, and that's credibility.
Yeah, when a US president writes that he no longer feels obligated to think purely of peace because he didn't get a medal, that isn't just a cringe moment. Well, it is, but it's also a warning light for every finance minister and central banker reading it.
Markets don't demand perfection from leaders. They demand predictability. They need to believe that major decisions about war, peace, and trade aren't being driven by who got invited on the stage in Oslo.
So when gold prices jump and the dollar stumbles on the same day that this letter starts circulating, that's not a coincidence. That's investors saying, this is not the kind of behavior we trust with long-term stability, and Europe knows it.
Europe is treating this as a test, not just of Trump, but of themselves. Can they defend a small territory's right to decide its own future without letting a trade war escalate out of control? Can they push back on coercion without blowing up the alliance entirely?
And Canada's being tested too. Can we stay calm and principled while still actually doing something? Or do we do what we've done often in the past? Talk a good game about the rules-based order and then duck when it matters.
And that brings us to
Manitoba's Wav Canoe. He's standing in Winnipeg, 1,000 kilometers south of Hudson Bay, saying out loud what a lot of military planners say in private. If this Greenland mess keeps going, Churchill might be our only hope.
His argument is simple. Canada has a lot of great plans for the North, but we have exactly one deep-water Arctic port and one rail line that feeds it, and that's Churchill.
So if you need to send supplies, troops, equipment, even just fuel and food into the Arctic in a real crisis, you don't ship it through a talking point. You ship it through a port.
Canoe says he's been talking to armed forces people over the years, and one line has stuck with him. Amateurs think about strategy. Professionals, they think about logistics.
In other words, you can hold all the summits you want about Arctic sovereignty, but if you can't actually get a ship or a train up there when it counts, well, you're just making speeches.
He's pushing Ottawa because if the U.S. shuts down the border or levies tariffs, Churchill is the only door we have left that Americans don't control. So that's the quiet, practical side of this crisis. While Trump is writing letters about prizes and complete and total control, one Prairie Premier is saying, if you're worried about Greenland and the Arctic tension, think Churchill.
Because the same port that helps us send grain and resources to Europe and Asia is also the port that lets Canada show up in the Arctic on our own terms, not just through American infrastructure.
Now layer that on top of what Ottawa is debating behind closed doors.
Yes, Bloomberg, CBC, and others are all reporting the same thing. Carney is actively considering sending Canadian troops to Greenland. Not just the Air Force units already there on a NORAD exercise, but additional forces for Danish-led sovereignty drills.
Those wouldn't be some giant invasion force. We're talking about a defined Canadian contribution to help protect critical infrastructure in Greenland. That means airfields, radar, ports, all as a part of NATO's Arctic presence.
And the timing here is what is the tricky part. Trump has already announced 10% tariffs rising to 25% in June on European countries that sent troops to Greenland. So, if Canada joins them, we're not just sending soldiers, we're stepping into that same line of fire. So, it's kind of crazy, but that is the full picture for everybody. Sovereignty isn't just speeches at NATO and quotes in Davos. It's whether we can stand with Denmark in Greenland and, at the same time, keep our own Arctic supplied through places like Churchill.
So now it's your turn. If NATO comes knocking and asks Canada to put troops in a formal Greenland mission, do you want us in? Should Canadian soldiers be a part of that line in the snow saying sovereignty isn't a bargaining chip?
Or do you think that drags us too far into a mess between Washington and Brussels, and we should stick to statements and just stay home?
Tell us in the comments, especially if you're watching from Europe or from the Arctic communities in Canada. How does this look from where you're sitting?
So that'll do it for today, and if you want more calm but honest breakdowns like this instead of shoutfest, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and share this with a friend who still thinks the Greenland story is just a meme from 2019.
Because whatever happens next, Greenland isn't a joke, and it isn't a trophy. It's a home to real people caught between two very powerful neighbors.
So thanks for watching, everybody. And as always, if you want to support this channel and keep it independent, please consider joining the A-Team. We love having you here. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow.